Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, July 30th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We are going to get into the SEC today, make all of my predictions for the 2024 season, but before we get into that, I do want to talk about something that has been happening in our sport for quite some time, kind of the division between the haves and the have-nots, and it's been kind of slowly making its way up the ladder in college football, and frankly, I think it might make its way into the SEC and the Big Ten. So I'll kind of break down what I mean and how quickly we are going to get to that reality. Then we'll get into the SEC predictions. We'll first do the breakdown of every team, just quick thoughts on everyone, and then we'll get into all the predictions. I'll give you records for everyone, the championship, obviously, the champion, offensive player of the year, defensive player of the year, freshman, transfer, all of those of the year for the SEC this upcoming year. And then we'll get into the recruiting update. There is a ton going on. Auburn is on absolute tear. Tennessee right there with them, so we'll break down both of those universities and how they might just be heading for something special in both those places. Then we'll get into kind of a Tuesday catch-up. We'll get into some big headlines across the sport, as I'm sure a lot of you seen. The Ra Thomas situation we will absolutely get into at the end of the show. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the Tip and Donation link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and that's always good for the both of us. But let's jump right in here and let's talk about this, because I think this is one of the big questions in college sports right now. Obviously, the division between the haves and the have-nots has been growing for quite some time, at least for the last decade, but you can go further back than that if you really want to. There are so many different things that are leaning towards the people that have the most money, the Texas, the Notre Dames, the Ohio States, all of those teams that can spare, $22 million to work on the revenue sharing, or can spare $20 million to spend on their football team, which we'll get into here in a second. But overall, this is a reality in the sport. And for the most part, it's been splitting itself by conference. So the SEC and the Big Ten, we know has a lot of money. We know have a lot of teams that are going to be problems for a lot of people in the NIL and just in the money market overall. Then on the other side, you have the ACC, the Big 12 on the group of five, where there are some issues on the money side of things, and you don't necessarily have as much. But something I've kind of been noticing is it's just kind of making its way up the sport. It started with the FCS, and the FBS was the big division that you could find. Now it's more Power 4 and Group of 5 is the big-time division. And then if you want to look a little bit further, you can get to the SEC and the Big 10 compared to the Big 12 and the ACC, and that's a division between those two. And I think it just might go deeper than that over the next couple of years, because as I kind of get into this and break down all of the different things going on in the sport, you see a headline like we saw a couple of days ago with Ohio State spending $20 million in NIL on their football team a year ago. That's a crazy number, and it's not a number that everyone can keep up with, even if you're in the Big Ten. So it's kind of a complicated question, and it's one of those that could lead to a lot of different things, whether it's, some people being asked to leave a conference or anything of that nature. There's a reality there, and I think it's one of those things that has kind of been developing for quite some time, but the haves and the have-nots have never been more different in this sport, and frankly, I don't think that's going away anytime soon. I actually think it's going to infiltrate some of these big-time conferences. When you look at the SEC and the Big Ten, you know that Texas and Texas A&M, they're fine with money. They are never going to have a problem financially because they have a lot of oil fields in their state that have a lot of people connected to their universities that it's not going to be an issue. I can almost promise you that. Same thing with Ohio State or Michigan or Notre Dame. They're never going to have issues with the money on the other side of revenue sharing or on the other side of contracts and employment if that comes up. All of this stuff is maybe something they don't want to deal with, or maybe something they're not too interested in, but at the same time, something they can totally handle. On the other side of things, you have Vandy, you have Northwestern, you have UCLA, who's in a very bad financial situation right now, that maybe can't handle that quite as much. I'm going beyond even the $22 million for the revenue sharing, going into NIL funds, collectives, all of those things. There's going to be a gap that forms. And in these conferences, I think there's going to be a gap that forms, and there's a lot of things that go into that. Obviously, when you look at the makeup of Vandy or Northwestern, it's very different than the makeup of a Texas or Ohio State. They are very much more pointed towards academics. They're definitely in more of a research-based kind of university approach to the way that they do business, especially around money, and that makes sense. That's what makes them a special university. That what gets them a lot of the money that they make, and it also brings up kind of an interesting point in the would you kick out someone question, because that's obviously been something that people have kicked around a little bit. The SEC possibly kicking out Vandy, or the Big Ten possibly asking Northwestern to leave because they're not necessarily performing athletically the way that you would want them to. I can almost promise that won't happen. I don't necessarily know what's going on in these conversations, and maybe things change throughout time where you're not too worried about the academic side of things, but I can almost promise you the amount of money that Northwestern and Vandy bring in from research and from different things around the academic side of things makes them more than worth it to keep it in the SEC or the Big Ten. But that doesn't change the fact that there is going to be segmentation. There is going to be a reality where there are, let's say, 10 teams that can win each of these conferences any given year, and then everyone else doesn't really have a shot because their financial situation, because they can't keep up in the NIL or the revenue sharing model, or they just don't want to. That's just not their priority right now. Their priority is more aimed towards academics than athletics. So that's going to be kind of the interesting conversation here, and how people approach it will likely change. I would not be surprised at all if Vandy started pushing a little bit more money in the in the athletic direction. I think that's exactly what Georgia Tech is doing right now, and some things are turning around there when it comes to the athletic department. So I think there's is going to be something that really starts to form over the next 3, 5, maybe even 7 years, because there's going to be a lot of movement, right? You're still going to have people adding to these conferences, the Big Ten and the SEC. You're still going to have a lot of questions around, who fits where and how this is going to be allocated and everything in between. So this is obviously something that will kind of show itself over the next couple of years as we get into the revenue sharing and the contract and the employment or whatever is on the horizon. Once we get into that future, we'll have a better idea of what this looks like. But I tend to believe it's no longer going to be the haves are the Big Ten and the SEC, and the have-nots are the ACC and the Big 12. I think the haves might be the top half of the SEC and the Big Ten, and the have-nots will be the bottom half of the SEC and the Big Ten, because while you do have huge media contracts coming in for a lot of these schools, and Vanderbilt and Northwestern hypothetically can handle putting in that revenue sharing agreement, they also might have financial troubles other places, and UCLA might be the best example of this, where yes, they are getting a big time media deal, yes, they are doing X, Y, and Z, and definitely doing a lot of great things to push them in a better direction financially. It doesn't mean that they can dole out $22 million in a year. They're just not in a position to do that, and it's a very, very different thing than what Ohio State is dealing with, where they can put up $20 million in NIL to their football team, which we'll break down a little bit later in the show. But overall, it's obviously kind of a crazy thing, and it's something that has kind of just been coming for the sport for quite some time. We've seen the segmentation between the FBS and the FCS. We've seen it between the Power 4 and the Group of 5. We've seen it between the SEC and the Big 10. I don't think it's crazy to think we'll see it within these conferences. And I don't know if it'll necessarily change anything in terms of how these conferences are built. I don't know if the quote-unquote have-nots will be asked to leave, or if that will even remotely work, because there's a million different contracts and things you have to get through. But overall, there are gaps here. Texas and Texas A&M are playing a different game financially than someone like Vandy is, or someone like Kentucky is, or South Carolina, although Kentucky has plenty of money. They're just pushing it a little bit different directions. But overall, it's one of those things that you now have different schools within these two big-time conferences that have different resources than everyone else, and have different abilities to push themselves in the revenue-sharing area and push themselves into NIL and give their guys, a little bit more in terms of NIL money and in terms of what they're getting while they're on campus. So it's this weird kind of thing that has been happening on a grand scale in the sport for quite some time. We've seen a lot of different segmentations as it's gone on, and 99% of the time it's been because who has the most money, they tend to find their way to the top. Who has the least tends to find their way to the bottom. But I think it's going to happen within conferences, and it'll be fascinating to see just how that unfolds. Are there 8 teams that can win it in the SEC and 8 teams that can't, and that's just the way it is? Everyone kind of moves forward all happy with that. Are some teams asked to leave? I think that's a little bit more out of the question, but definitely something that could happen depending on who that team is. Let's just hypothetically say, I'm not necessarily preying on South Carolina's downfall here, but let's say South Carolina falls on some hard times and they're not necessarily performing very well academically or athletically, and the SEC is sitting there saying, we could add a Clemson, or we could add a Florida State, or we could add a someone that could fill that gap and maybe give us a little bit more. I don't necessarily think that's out of the question, but I think we're a pretty far road from that happening. But overall, I think it's one of those things where you look at it, and 5 years ago, you knew that there was a gap between Ohio State and Northwestern. You knew there was a gap between Texas and Texas Tech. You knew there was a financial gap between those two universities. Now it's becoming even more advantageous to be the one that has the haves, to be the one that has the deep pocketbooks, and be the one that can dole out $22 million or $20 million to the football team, or any number of things that Texas, that Ohio State, that Notre Dame, that all of these big-time schools can do that others just can't or are not willing to. So it's one of those kind of interesting conversations with, who's going to be those teams? Who are going to be the ones that are the have-nots in the SEC even? Because the gap is forming even more. The haves and the have-nots is changing. The definition of that, the haves is becoming even more bumped up. You have to have whatever the number is, $150 million coming in every year if you're really going to compete in this sport. I don't know that to be the number, but let's just take that as a moniker. And then on the other side, you have to push a lot of money into athletics and maybe not focus on academics quite as much. So it's one of those questions that is going to be really interesting to see unfold, because there's a lot of different ways that this can go. Notre Dame and Northwestern hypothetically are the teams that you'd be circling in the SEC and the Big Ten, but they have plenty of money. They just happen to push it more in the academic direction than the athletic. And if they change that, then they're absolutely a team that could make noise in this conference. But they're pretty far from doing that, and I don't necessarily think they should do that by any means. So I think it's one of those things that it's going to be fascinating to watch. We've seen this sport be kind of broken down into the haves and have-nots even more and more and become more specific. I think it's about to get a little bit more specific in these conferences, in the SEC and the Big Ten. Who are the haves, who are the have-nots, and the have-nots have essentially no shot to win that conference. So it'll be really interesting to watch that unfold. This is obviously a little bit longer term of a thing, 3, 5, 7 years, but at the end of the day, at some point, we could see a world where you show up to SEC Media Days and about half or at least 6 of the teams have no shot to win that thing. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to do an SEC breakdown, give you quick thoughts on every team before we get into our predictions in segment 3. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows where 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the kind of segmentation of the sport and how I tend to believe it's going to continue into these conferences even a little bit, and it'll be very interesting to watch that unfold. But let's get into an SEC breakdown, give you quick thoughts on every team before we get into our predictions in the next segment, and there's a ton to break down, so let's go ahead and jump in here. One of the big time questions here is, What happens with Alabama? No Nick Saban anymore. It could be no problem. We'll figure out what Kalen DeBoer has going into this year in Tuscaloosa. Obviously, a ton of pressure on him. There's no two ways about that. Whoever took that job was going to have a ton of pressure on them, and he's done a great job thus far. But it's about time to lace him up and really prove your point. So it'll be really interesting to watch that unfold. I think Jalen Milroe is probably the most important player in this conference because if he fits this offense, if he can make those NFL level throws that we've talked about pretty much ad nauseum on here, if he can make those throws, then this is going to be a championship level team. There's no two ways about it. The back end defense and really the defense as a whole is a little bit of a worry. I think there's plenty of ability out there. There's no question about that. But I definitely think if they can't get to the quarterback with guys like Keon Keeley and Qua Rassaw, I think they're really going to have some trouble this year. So it could cost them a trip to the playoff if they're not careful. But Arkansas is another really interesting team. This is the team that likely has to worry about their coach the most going into this year. Sam Pittman is hanging on by a thread, and they bought Bobby Petrino in, and frankly, I don't think they brought him in just to be the offensive coordinator. I think they're planning on him possibly taking over at some point this season as the head coach, so it'll be really interesting. Obviously, Taylon Green coming over from Boise State was an absolutely huge get. Jaquindon Jackson over from Utah. The running attack is going to be really fun. There's no two ways about that. The offensive line is maybe not going to be quite as fun, so it'll be interesting to watch this team, but overall, they might be in a little bit of trouble in Fayetteville this year. Auburn is one of those very, very interesting teams because they're so variable. Peyton Thorne, if he plays that 2021 level football, they could be a team that really makes some noise. If he plays 2023 level football, it won't be a great year for the Tigers, or at least not the year that they want. It does help that they have one of, if not the best running back in the conference in Jarquez Hunter, an absolute beast and someone that can just outright carry an offense. And then you have Cam Coleman on the outside, the just ridiculous freshman wide receiver that I expect to be an absolute beast, and he's someone that can absolutely make noise against some of the bigger teams that you're going to play, and sometimes you just need that difference maker in those big games against Georgia and Bama late in the season. So that'll be awesome to watch. Florida is obviously a team that is another team that has to worry about their head coach. There's definitely a lot of things around Billy Napier that is going to be a little bit worrisome going into this year. They do not have an easy schedule by any means, probably the hardest that I've ever seen, if I'm being totally honest with you. The roster is still really good. There's a ton of talent out there. They have so many guys that can make some plays. Graham Mertz is in full control of this offense and can definitely run it at an elite level. Eugene Wilson is one of the best wide receivers in the conference, and ditto for Montrell Johnson on the ground. So they absolutely have dudes, and I think it might just come down to those, as Josh Pate would put it, bounce of ball plays. The plays that you don't really know which way they're going to go. Maybe a pick bounces off a receiver's hands, goes into someone else's. Those are the type of plays that might decide Florida's season and might decide the future of Billy Napier at that university. Georgia is obviously the team coming into this with the most, right? They are the team that everyone's watching, trying to capture their third national title in 4 years. It would be insane if they were able to pull that off, but Carson Beck is about as steady as they come. In my opinion, he's the most talented quarterback that Kirby Smart has had during his time, and I think Kirby Smart said the O-line and the wide receivers are as good as they've ever had it. So you can imagine the offense is going to be pretty incredible this year. The defense is going to be disruptive, led by Michael Williams. There are some worries on the back end of that defense and on the interior of that defensive line, but when you have someone like CJ Allen in the middle of that defense and then Malachi Starks in the back end, there are a lot of things that can go wrong, and you still have a very, very good defense there. So not super worried about that. I definitely think it could be an issue, but as of right now, I don't have much reason to worry about Georgia in that respect. Kentucky is a fascinating team to me, and one of those teams I have a soft spot for. I think Brock Vandagriff is one of those guys that is super variable. He's someone that I think has all the talent in the world, but hasn't played a lot of football. Has definitely been kind of riding the bench a little bit there at Georgia, but it seems like Mark Stoops is very, very confident in this team. He said it's gelling as well as any team he's ever had, and Mark Stoops can win a lot of games if he has a team that is gelling. So I think it's kind of a boom or bust team. They do have Deone Walker, one of the best players in the country on the defensive line. Maxwell Harrison on the back end is an absolute beast at corner. Barry Brown is just one of the fastest guys in the entire country. So they can make some noise. There's no two ways about that, but it's going to come down to that quarterback position and what Brock Vandagriff can do this year. LSU is always a very interesting team, coming off a year where they lost a Heisman Trophy winner, 2 first-round picks at wide receiver. You would expect them to not have a great offense. they're going to have a really good offense. I can promise you that. Garrett Nussmeier, a.k.a. the Gumbo Gunslinger, one of my favorite nicknames in college football, he is ready to roll, and he is someone that has been waiting in the wings for just too long. The wide receiver core with Kyron Lacey and C.J. Daniels and Chris Hilton is going to be plenty. I can promise you that. The defensive staff hires were absolutely huge for this team, and you don't necessarily love the personnel that you have, but when you have someone like Harold Perkins, then a lot of that is subsided very quickly. He can totally change the perception of this team, this defense, and maybe just send them to a playoff if he plays the way that a lot of people expect him to in this defense. Mississippi State is one of those teams that's just going under a lot of change this year. Jeff Lebby getting his start at the head coaching position, Blake Shapen coming over from Baylor to be their starting quarterback. There's a lot of questions here. I do think it's going to be a really fun offense. They're going to move really fast, make it hard for defenses to get set. But overall, I think it's going to be a little bit tough to keep up with teams. I think it might be a first half team that, is really close, maybe down 7 or down 3, or maybe up 7 or up 3 at halftime, and then loses by about 14 to 21 points. But we'll see what happens with Mississippi State this year. Ole Miss in the same state is absolutely tearing it up. They are the hype team going into this year. They are the team that everyone's pointing to saying, that's your SEC title, or at least they're getting to the SEC title game. Jackson Dart being back at quarterback is huge. Wide receiver room is just out of this world, bringing in Juice Wells from South Carolina. Lane Kiffin calling plays. The offense is going to be incredible. The defense does have to rely on some big-time transfers. Walter Nolan, Chris Paul Jr., Brandon Turnage, a million guys on that side of the ball that are going to make big-time leaps this year and really have to for this team to make some noise. Then you have Missouri, a team that's coming off one of the best years you've seen in recent history from Missouri. They have one of the best offensive player in my opinion in the country in Luther Burden. I think he's an absolute monster. And then Brady Cook being back, there's tons of ability all over the place for this team. The big effect is going to be the defensive coaching losses. Blake Baker leaving, Kevin Peoples leaving. Does that have a big time effect on this defense? I tend to worry a little bit about it, but we'll see obviously when the season does come around. Oklahoma is one of the teams making their appearance in the SEC for the very first time. They're a really dangerous team. The only two questions I have for this team are, frankly, the two biggest questions when you go into the SEC. How are you playing on both lines of scrimmage? If they can figure out the offensive line especially, but the defensive line as well, if both of those units can be, let's say, B- B football for the entire year, there's tons of ability across the board. I mean, they have the quarterback, in my opinion, in Jackson Arnold. The wide receiver group is one of the best in the country and definitely getting a little bit disrespected in some of these lists. The running backs, I think, is going to be awesome, led by Gavin Sawchuk. The back end is elite. The linebacker core is one of the best in the country in Danny Stutzman. So if they can play that line of scrimmage well, they'll be more than fine. But as of right now, I'm not too confident in that being the case. South Carolina is a really interesting team because they got Lenora Sellers under center. He is one of those guys that is going to make at least 3, 4, 5 plays this year that are going to make your jaw drop. He is an absolute athletic beast and someone that can be a problem for literally any defense. This team is definitely going to have to rely on some younger players, Nichols Harbor, Dylan Edwards, some of these guys that are coming in that might not have the experience, but if you're going to make noise, there's definitely going to have to be some of those young guys that really make some noise this upcoming year. Tennessee is one of those other big-time hype teams, and Nico Iamaleava is the big-time reason for that. He is someone that I'm watching incredibly closely. The wide receiver core is about as fun as it gets with Chris Brazzell coming in from Tulane. Absolutely huge pickup for that team. The defense continues to make strides as Josh Heupel gets a little bit more involved in the recruiting battle and everything out there. James Pierce Jr. obviously leading the way for this defense, but there's plenty of other guys that can play really good ball, and I expect them to this upcoming year. So Tennessee is one of those teams that is really, really dangerous in this conference this upcoming year. Then you have Texas, another team coming into the conference, and they're coming in with title hopes. There's no two ways about that. You bring Quinn Ewers back for a third year. Remarkably good circumstances at Texas. I mean, the wide receiver group is absolutely ridiculously deep. It's definitely a year where Texas can really be quote-unquote back. Obviously, last year was a huge step in that direction, but I think every Texas fan and everyone in Austin would tell you they got to do it multiple years in a row if they really want to be someone to be worried about. So definitely a huge year for them and a lot of things pointing in the right direction in Austin, that's for sure. Texas A&M is another team that I'm watching very closely, another kind of boom or bust team because Connor Wegman is a guy that can totally light the world on fire or could get injured, and it could be kind of a tough year. Obviously not going to predict injuries by any means, but this is a really talented team, and I think Mike Elko, even though it's in his first year in the SEC as a head coach, the defense is going to be a really solid group. If Connor Wegman can hit all the right buttons, then this team is really dangerous. And then you have Vandy. I think they're going to be a fun team to watch at the very least. Diego Pavia coming over from New Mexico State is a really fun addition and was able to go into Auburn and beat them a year ago. So maybe that gives you a little bit of hope as a Vandy fan. Overall, I've talked about this before. I don't know what the head coach of Vanderbilt football is meant to do. He doesn't have the resources, the recruiting there's nothing in place there that needs to be where it should be for them to compete in this conference. So overall, it's not going to be pretty this year. It hasn't been pretty for the last decade, and it probably won't be pretty for quite some time to come unless something really drastic changes out there. But overall, obviously a crazy conference, so many different teams that can make some noise, and my rankings definitely show that. There is a big-time logjam up top, and we'll break it down right after this. So stick with us, and we'll come back with all of my picks for the SEC in 2024.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just did a little breakdown of all of the SEC teams, gave you quick thoughts on all of them, and now it's time to make some predictions, and I am very nervous about this one because this is a conference that could go any number of different directions. I probably had about 6 or 7 different matchups in Atlanta at the end of the year that I could sell myself on, but at the end of the day, I came back to the one that I just kept coming back to every single time, and that was Texas against Georgia. And I agree that this is a little bit bland. I totally understand that. But overall, these are two teams that when I look week to week, I just don't see anyone being able to match up long throughout the season. I think Georgia is one of those teams that people point to the really hard schedule and definitely something that Kirby Smart hasn't really had to deal with before. They'll be more than fine. They are comfortably a really good team and one of those teams that I think, especially on the offensive side of the ball, is just going to be impossible to deal with. Texas is one of those teams that people do have questions about the physicality as they walk into this conference, and frankly, I do too. But when I look up and down this roster, it's hard for me to find a place where they're really going to struggle. The offensive line is one of the best in the entire country. The D-line goes about 5 or 6 deep on that defensive tackle front, and the edge rushing is going to be as good as it's ever been. The back end is the other worry, but when you have really good edge rushing, the back end looks a lot better than it usually would. So I feel pretty good about these two really making not quick work by any means of this schedule, but definitely being the teams to beat throughout the entire year in this conference, and I expect them to be in Atlanta. Now, I do have LSU at 10-2, and this is a little bit me buying into this new defensive staff, buying into Harold Perkins being an absolute game changer, and all of that type of stuff. You have Ole Miss right there at 10-2 as well. I think this is a really good team. I think they're going to be able to put together a really special season and maybe win that Alabama game that has been eluding them, or win that LSU game that has been eluding them for quite some time. So I think this is going to be a really good team, and definitely a team that people are going to have to worry about this upcoming year. Alabama, I expect to take a step back. I just don't think this fits as quite as well as some people want it to. I don't think Jalen Milroe is going to take the big-time strides that he needs to take, and I think this defensive side of the ball is just not nearly as good as it needs to be, if I'm being totally honest. A&M is a really interesting team. There's just too many variables there. Tennessee is a team that I think could be, 11-1 at the end of the year, but when you look at, when they have to play Georgia, when they have to play Bama, when they have to play LSU, I just don't love those matchups for them, if I'm being totally honest, although they could easily win all of those matchups, honestly. Missouri is another team that I really like. I have too many questions when it comes down to that defensive side of the ball in particular about how they're going to handle Blake Baker moving on and that type of thing. So just didn't feel comfortable putting them all the way at the top. Oklahoma, I think, is going to be a good team, but is going to miss that physicality on the front that they're going to need to win this conference. Florida, I think, is going to be a much better team than people give them credit for, and I think a 7-5 Florida might just be a top 20, 25, 15 team in the country, if I'm being totally honest. Kentucky and Auburn, I think, are really interesting this upcoming year. They definitely are going to make some noise, but overall, week to week, I just don't necessarily love the product that is going to be put out on the field by them. I think South Carolina, Mississippi State, Arkansas, and Vandy, it's just going to be a little bit tough. I think South Carolina can make some noise with Lenora Sellers, with Nick Harbor, with some of the athletic guys that they have. I think Mississippi State can get some guys off kilter with the offense that they're going to run, but overall, I just don't think it's going to be that pretty, and I do think Arkansas will have to find a new coach at the end of the year with Sam Pittman moving on, and then Vandy, it's Vandy. I wish I could put them anywhere else, but this is just the reality of where they're at in this conference right now. But let's move on to all of the predictions. You have my championship matchup in Texas and Georgia. It's one of those that I battle with myself about 10 different ways from Tuesday about, but at the end of the day, I feel pretty confident in these guys definitely being the best throughout the entire season and meeting in Atlanta. But let's get into predictions, and I do have Georgia winning this thing. I understand that there is going to be a big-time matchup in Atlanta, and Georgia's facing a schedule that by the time they get to Atlanta, they might be beaten and battered just a little bit, but this is the best team in this conference. It plainly is. This is a team that absolutely is going to make so much noise across every single aspect of this sport. And I think the biggest thing for me is Carson Beck is an absolute difference maker at quarterback. He's someone that they just haven't had in the past years, and someone that can make some throws that are just out of this world ridiculous. The wide receiver group is as good as there is in the country when you're talking about depth and being able to spread the ball around the field. You add that to the tight ends they have, it's absolutely ridiculous. And then on the defensive side of the ball, you can worry about the nitpicky things within that team, but when you have guys on every level that are as dominant as Michael Williams, as CJ Allen, as Malachi Starks, you're going to have very few problems on the defensive side of the ball. So I do think Georgia's going to take this thing home. I think the offensive player of the year will be Quinn Ewers, though. I think this offense, with Quinn Ewers going into his third year at Texas, I'm just betting on that being the big-time thing. When you go into a third year of an offense like Steve Sarkisian's, you tend to put up pretty crazy numbers. There's no two ways about that. What's up, Hawaii 5-0? Good to see you. Definitely a team that I think just has infinite amount of weapons. You look at this wide receiver group, and people are wondering, how do the transfer wide receivers fit in? Well, Isaiah Bond has gotten glowing reviews. Silas Bolden, even more so, has been absolutely maybe the talk of the town during their fall camp or during their summer workouts into fall camp. Matthew Golden is going to be a problem, whether it's receiving or returning. Then you have Ryan Wingo, Jonte Cook, DeAndre Moore, and more guys that can catch the football. And then you add it to the tight end group with Gunnar Helm and Amari Niblack. It's going to be ridiculous the amount of ways that they're going to be able to get the ball out and play around with different defenses. And Steve Sarkisian can do that at an elite level, as we saw in 2020. The O-line is the best that Sark has had during his time at Texas, and it's by a pretty comfortable margin. I think Kelvin Banks over there at left tackle is one of those guys that you're not going to see a lot of people get through him, just plain and simple. It doesn't matter who they're playing. It doesn't matter who they're going up against. There's not going to be a matchup that he looks outmatched in. I can almost promise you that. So overall, I just think this kid is going to be special this year. I know Quinn Ewers has had some trouble in the past with some deep balls, but you make that slight adjustment on that deep ball, then the numbers are going to be absolutely ridiculous. And then the other guy I'm watching there is obviously Carson Beck. Another one, Luther Burden, would be very interesting in this spot, but overall, I think Quinn Ewers is going to be the guy that just puts up ridiculous numbers this upcoming year. Defensive Player of the Year, I do have Harold Perkins. This is one I debated in my mind for a long, long time, but overall, I just think he has to be. I think you bring in Blake Baker, you bring in this defensive staff, you bring in Kevin Peoples especially, you have to be able to put this guy in the right positions. And frankly, when that happens, he is a special player. We all watched him in his freshman year, and there was a moment where I was like, is this the best player in football? Even in his freshman year, where he just made every single play that was in front of him. It was absolutely remarkable, and he played some good football last year, even when he was misused, even when he wasn't put in the situations that he was supposed to. He was one of the best linebackers in this conference. So I think he's one of those guys that needs to be really good for LSU to make the noise that they want to, and he's going to be really good. He is an absolute beast on the outside and one of those guys that is just going to be an absolute problem. He can straight up win games for you, whether it's with a pick or multiple sacks or anything in between. And I think he's going to do enough to get LSU to those 10 wins and get them in a position to possibly make the playoff at the end of the year. The other guy I'm watching here is Mykel Williams, the edge from UGA. I think that guy's going to be an absolute game wrecker this year and make just every quarterback life just problem. I'll be totally honest, for about 4 hours there on a Saturday. But the freshman of the year, I've gone back and forth on this one a little bit. I do think Cam Coleman will win it. I think he's just going to make enough plays. I don't necessarily think Auburn's going to be this remarkable team at the end of the year, but I do think he's going to be a guy that you look back and just are so excited about 2025 for him. I think he's going to be the leading receiver of the team. I think he's one of those guys that when you go up against the Georgias and the Alabamas, you're going to see that there's not really that big gap between him and everyone else. Obviously, Auburn's one of those teams where you rarely ever see a big-time gap, but this guy especially is going to match up on guys, and it's going to look unfair as a freshman. So he's someone that can totally tear apart defenses, and as you might have noticed, I have 2 freshmen of the years in the Big Ten and the SEC. They're both wide receivers. The freshman wide receiver class this year is going to go down as, frankly, one of the best in recent history, maybe one of the best in overall history. So a really remarkable group, and I think Cam Coleman might just lead the way in that respect. And then PJ Woodland, a corner at LSU, I think is going to have a really good year and could definitely be up for this award, and especially if he plays elite football and gets LSU's defense where it needs to be, he might just be a shoo-in for this award. And then the transfer of the year, I did go Trevor Etienne. I think he's going to have an effect on this team that is going to be just incredible. Whether it's running the ball behind this really good offensive line or catching the ball out of the backfield, I think he's going to be one of those guys that's just going to always make plays. There might be a couple of games where he gets bottled up. I know Florida is very much looking forward to trying to bottle this guy up, but overall, I think he's just going to be a problem. And when you have so many other things to worry about in that Georgia offense, Trevor Etienne could very easily just sneak out and catch a little 5-yard pass for 30 yards after he catches the ball. So I think he's going to be absolutely remarkable, and I think this elite O-line definitely helps that a lot. The other guy was Isaiah Bond. I was kind of going back and forth with them, but I think Texas is going to spread the ball out quite a bit, so I don't necessarily think Isaiah Bond's numbers are going to be out of this world crazy by any means. But yeah, overall, this conference is going to be a fight. There's so many different variables here, and frankly, I could very easily see, Texas going 9-3 and Tennessee going 11-1, or Ole Miss going 11-1 and Texas going 10-2. There are so many different variables here and so many different teams you could slot into that Atlanta matchup, and I would feel more than fine with it. But overall, when I look at it, Texas and Georgia are the 2 best teams walking into this conference this upcoming year. They have the most depth. They have the fewest questions. They have so many things going in the right direction for them. And it's hard for me to sit here and say with absolute confidence that anyone else is going to be in Atlanta. So call it a lame pick. I have no problem with that. It definitely is a little bit lame, but at the end of the day, I definitely do think those are the 2 best teams in this conference, and I think we'll see them in Atlanta, and then we might just see them again. So we might just see them 3 times during the season, but overall, I do have Georgia and Texas being the teams in Atlanta at the end of the year, with Georgia taking home yet another SEC title. But let's take another break here, and when we come back, we're going to do a little bit of a recruiting update. Tennessee and Auburn have been on fire on the recruiting trail, and I got to break it down for you guys. So we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. I just gave all of my SEC picks for this upcoming year, and yes, I do have Georgia winning that conference. I understand it's a hard schedule. They're the best team. I have no problem saying that, and I do think they're going to end up taking home the hardware at the end of the year. But let's get into a little bit of a recruiting update, and we'll stick in the SEC just here for a little bit because the Auburn Tigers and the Tennessee Volunteers have been doing work on the recruiting trail, and we got to talk about it because these are 2 programs that can build into something really special if they continue this. But let's jump into this and let's talk about First of all, let's get into Auburn, because they are a team that just tore up this weekend. It's absolutely incredible the number of people that they brought in, and they brought in a couple of them from their foe in Alabama. But let's jump into this, and Shadarius Tootle is someone that's very, very talented, 4-star linebacker that they just got committed. He had offers from A&M, Ohio State, among many others, top 5 linebacker in the class of 2026, so a little bit further down the road, but still a very, very talented guy, and definitely someone that can play pretty much immediately when he shows up on campus at Auburn. Definitely a really talented person, and cannot wait to see him in Auburn colors, although it's going to take a little time to get there. Blake Woodby is another guy that I'm watching very closely. He committed to Auburn this past week, and a very, very talented kid. Had offers from Maryland and Oregon, is from Baltimore, so that was where the Maryland kind of tie was coming in, and this is a guy that was formerly committed to Ohio State, so stealing someone from Ohio State never hurts too bad, that's for sure. That's definitely someone that, it's definitely someone that Ohio State was looking at as possibly someone that could come in and start with a lot of guys leaving next year. Likely will be the same exact thing for Auburn, so a huge pickup for the Tigers there. Antonio Coleman is one of the weirdest recruitments in the cycle right now, but he has committed to Auburn, decommitted from Alabama to Auburn, and that's the second time he's done this. He committed to Alabama, committed to Auburn, decommitted from Auburn, committed back to Alabama, and is now decommitted from Alabama and committed back to Auburn. So he's bounced back and forth quite a bit in the state of Alabama, but a very talented defensive lineman from Saraland High School, where a ton of really talented guys in Alabama are coming out of this year. KJ Lacey, the big-time quarterback, being probably the main among them, along with Ryan Williams, who is now at Alabama this year, but was a very talented guy at that school a year ago. So this is a very weird recruitment, and you might want to keep your eyes on this one until the very finish line, but as of right now, a big-time win for the Tigers. The other one they stole from Alabama was Derek Smith. He flipped his commitment, an elite athlete in this class, the number 2 athlete in the 2025 class, behind Michael Terry III, a very talented guy in his own right, but this is huge. This is one of those guys that likely they wouldn't even be in the battle for a couple of years ago with Nick Saban at the helm and with so many different things heading in Alabama's direction. I don't know if they would even have a shot here, but now they do, and it's one of the big-time things that has been changing around there, and something that they're going to develop into just a ridiculous recruiting power if they can keep this going. They also added the number 16 recruit in the 2026 class, Hezzy Harris, a very talented edge rusher, and then you have 4-star linebacker JaMychal Garrett that they also, JaMychal Garrett that they added to the 2026 class. Both very, very talented guys, so Auburn just clicking on all cylinders. And then they added Anquan Fagans just for good measure. Last night they picked up Anquan Fagans from they beat out LSU, they beat out Georgia. This is a top 60 recruit, number 5 safety in the class. This is a really talented kid, and Auburn's all the way up to number 6 class in the country, or number 5, depending on where you look. Hugh Freeze and company are locking down Alabama in a way that they haven't in quite some time around Auburn, so a lot of things moving in the right direction for the Tigers, and if that's the case, then Auburn's not going to be a team that you don't have to worry about in the SEC much longer, I can promise you that. Tennessee is also on an absolute tear on the recruiting trail. They've been doing incredible work over the last couple of cycles, but especially this one, they've just been doing incredible work, and Lagonza Hayward is another addition to that. A 6'1", 205 safety, very talented kid out of Lyons, Georgia, the number 4 safety in this class. A very, very talented kid, someone that can totally dominate at pretty much any level you put him on, and frankly, going into Georgia and stealing a guy like this is absolutely huge for Tennessee, and something that they very much need to do more often. They've been attacking the defensive side of the ball just incredibly well this class, so cannot wait to see what they kind of develop into over the next little bit. They also added Deshaun Bram, a very, very talented kid. He was committed to Oregon, decommitted, and committed to Tennessee, and this is a 6'6", 230 tight end, so a big-time player, someone that absolutely is going to be a huge help to them pretty much the second that he steps on campus. I think he will likely start next year and will be a big-time player for them, so they're one of those teams that absolutely is doing really good work, and Oregon not necessarily doing quite as good work. They have lost a couple of commitments here recently that definitely hit a little bit harder, and this is one of them. Josiah Sharman, the 4-star defensive lineman, was committed to Oregon, is now committed to Texas. An absolutely huge get for Texas at a position where they very much needed to make up ground. Defensive line was not looking too great at the time, but Kenny Baker gets his first big-time win. This guy is a top 150 recruit in this class, a very, very talented guy, and someone that Texas really, really wanted the first time around and finally got him to decommit and come on over to Austin. So a huge pickup for them. And then you have Malik Clark, a 4-star wide receiver that he is committed to Florida State. The wide receiver class that Florida State is putting together is just incredible. C.J. Wiley, Dalen McCutcheon, and now Malik Clark. It's ridiculous what they've been able to do, and this guy is really, really talented. 6'3", 185, one of those lengthy, long receivers that Mike Norvell just absolutely loves. I think he's going to be a very talented kid, and probably going to play a part pretty early on because they're going to have a lot of guys leave from that wide receiver room this upcoming year. But overall, the wide receiver class is just absolutely insane, and I expect all of them to make big-time noise at the next level. Jamarian Gordon is a guy I want to talk about because he flipped his commitment from Alabama to UCF. A very, very interesting commitment here. Someone that I don't think anyone really expected, but overall an absolutely massive steal for Gus Malzahn and company. Alabama's been skidding just a little bit in recruiting lately. I'm not necessarily super worried about them by any means, but definitely losing some guys that they would love to keep in the fold. So that's definitely something to watch as we continue on through this cycle. And then we have one more in the 2025 class, and that's J.J. Haney. And this is a very interesting one because he's from Berlin, Germany. He's 6'4", 280 defensive lineman, and he is committed to Georgia. This is a very, very interesting addition and one of those really cool stories that'll be really fun to watch throughout the entirety of this thing. And I definitely think it's going to be incredible to watch this thing unfold. But overall, I do think this might just be Trey Scott's masterpiece. We added, there was another player on the offensive line, Jackson. I can't remember his exact name at this moment, but I do think they're bringing in guys that are just physically different, and then they'll figure out the football part a little bit later. This guy's been playing football for about 2 years now, so still plenty of work to be done, but when you get a guy that has those physical tools, you definitely take the opportunity. And then Tredarian Bell, we'll get into the 2026 class a little bit here. He is committed to Oregon. This is a 4-star running back, held offers from pretty much everyone. The main three were Texas, LSU, and USC outside of Oregon, but an absolutely huge pickup out of Texarkana, Texas, and a very, very talented guy, top 5 guy at the running back position in the 2026 class. So just doing incredible work and a really, really talented kid that absolutely adds to what Oregon is already building up there in Eugene. Georgia also had a really good day on the 2026 class. They had Jontavius Wyman, a very talented 4-star corner. This is a guy that they are just absolutely tearing apart right now. When you look at what T-Rob has done since he's shown up at UGA, it's been absolutely ridiculous, and as co-defensive coordinator, as DB coach, he's going to continue to do that. So I don't expect Georgia to ever really struggle in the back end of that defense, but especially now that they have someone like Travarius Robinson in there, I think they're going to do ridiculous things, frankly. And they added another one, Dominic Kelly, a 4-star cornerback in the 2026 class. He flipped from USC to Georgia, and Georgia has been the thorn in USC's side this recruiting class and likely will be going forward. I think there's a couple more here that could be a little bit of trouble for USC going into the next couple of weeks. But overall, it's an incredible pickup for UGA. Definitely someone that they absolutely wanted to get into the fold, and just goes to show you, when you lose someone like Fran Brown, who's so good at recruiting, you can bring in someone like Travarius Robinson and really not miss a beat by any means. So obviously 2 big-time pickups there, but let's get into some upcoming commitments and some intel on those commitments, and we'll start with Jonah Williams, a 5-star safety that is set to commit on the 24th of August, a very talented kid, number 1 safety in the class from Galveston, Texas. This guy is remarkably talented, and not just in football. He is a ridiculous baseball player, someone that absolutely will get drafted into the MLB next summer, and that's the big question here. I think Texas and LSU are really leading the way in this one with a slight lean to the Tigers, but overall, it could mean nothing. He could get drafted in the MLB, go on to the MLB, and leave college football behind. He could go to college football and play both sports. We'll see what happens. But overall, whoever can get him in their class is going to get a big-time player. And especially if he finally gets on campus, you'll definitely get a big-time player in the back end of your defense. But let's go to 5-star Elijah Griffin, a very talented defensive lineman. He's officially down to 3 schools, UGA, USC, and Miami. All of them have fairly good shots to make some runs here. I tend to lean UGA is going to win this one out, but overall, a very talented guy. Number 1 defensive lineman in the country, 5-star recruit in 2025, and a very, very talented kid. There's no two ways about that. I think USC is pushing really, really hard, but overall, I do think he will be a Bulldog at the end of the day. Then you have someone like David Sanders Jr. He has been really interesting to watch because I thought it was going to be UGA. I felt pretty confident that it was going to be UGA, and I think they still have a shot here, but Nebraska made up a ton of ground this weekend. Dylan Raiola made a point to make all of the fans come out and see him during his visit, and boy, did they. They definitely came out in force, and I think Nebraska is making a little bit of a push here. Tennessee's still very much in this, as well as Ohio State, so this could go any number of directions, but it'll definitely be a very interesting one to watch as we kind of come to the end of that recruitment. And then Michael Fasusi, another really talented 5-star offensive tackle. This is going to be a Texas OU A&M battle, and frankly, it looks a little bit more Texas OU battle than anything else. I think those two schools are definitely going to be fighting tooth and nail for this kid, and right now I would lean Texas, but Oklahoma's making up a ton of ground very, very quickly, and I think they might just win this one out. Bill Bedenbaugh is a remarkable recruiter, and him and Kyle Flood are going head-to-head right here, so it'll be interesting to see who wins that one out, and definitely will have some bragging rights over the others. But overall, recruiting is absolutely insane. We're going to have some big-time recruitments in August. It feels like a lot of 5-star recruits are trying to get their recruitment done before their senior year, enjoy their senior year, and then enroll early. So we'll definitely see some big-time commitments and some big-time movement in the rankings over the next little bit, and we'll break that down as it comes, obviously. But let's take our last break here, and when we come back, we're just going to do a little kick around, do a little catch-up, do all the big headlines around the sport over the last little bit, give you guys updated on everything that we just haven't gotten a chance to get really into over the last couple of days. So stick around, and we'll be right back with that. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the recruiting update from this past weekend and the past week really. Tennessee and Auburn have been doing absolute work on the recruiting trail and are definitely building up some really remarkable classes in the 2025 class. But let's get into a little bit of a headline catch-up. We do this kind of sporadically throughout the next little bit to kind of get you updated on all of the headlines that you need to know, and there are quite a few that we need to break down today. And it starts with Ra Thomas, definitely the biggest story in the sport right now. And it's a story that has been going on for quite some time at UGA. It is yet another arrest at UGA. Ra Thomas was arrested on Friday morning with 1 count of second-degree cruelty to children, a felony, and 2 counts of battery, both misdemeanors. All 3 were tagged with family violence, which essentially just means they were all involved with his family in one form or another. So he has been suspended indefinitely from the team. The details of the incident have not come out clearly, so I don't want to speak on this incident overall. I don't necessarily want to do anything that, puts me in a bad spot. Let's just put it that way. I definitely think this is a very serious issue, of course, and definitely will be very interesting to see how it's handled going forward, but he has been suspended, and we'll see what happens in the case going forward. But I've done my whole spiel on Georgia and all of the different things that have been happening over there, and a number of different things that I think might be able to kind of get them on the other side, but overall, I've talked about, all of the things that Kirby Smart has done. He has, kicked a guy off the team in Daniel David Sensenbaugh. He has, suspended players from the team like Ra Thomas, among others in the past. He has fined these kids with NIL money. He has brought in people to speak to them, done defensive driving classes, has done X, Y, and Z, and it's not working. That's just plain and simple. You can do a million different things. If they're not working, it doesn't necessarily matter, right? And this is obviously a very, very different situation than any of the other ones. Obviously, you can't necessarily draw a line between this and all of the different, traffic violations that have happened. It doesn't change that there is a problem at UGA. It doesn't change that there is an issue there that needs to be dealt with one way or the other. And over the last 18 months, it's been absolutely ridiculous what's been happening up there. There's no two ways about that. And although I do think they've been doing quite a bit to try to kind of quell this issue and make sure that it doesn't continue, it's continued, and you have to deal with it one way or the other. I've talked about this before. I tend to believe that at this point, it's got to fall on the players at some point. I think they have to be more vocal. I don't necessarily know that they haven't, but they got to at least be a little bit more vocal outwardly. Maybe just do something that maybe it makes you a little bit uncomfortable to call out your teammates. Maybe it makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable to, quote-unquote, scold your teammates. But this is the reality of your program. If you're going to save this program, if you're not going to be kind of an afterthought or one that you look back on and say, man, there was a lot of promise there, but off the field issues got in the way, something has to change. That's just the reality, and it's got to change pretty quickly. So this is obviously going to be something that is going to be really interesting to watch as it kind of unfolds. Obviously, we will give you updates as the Ra Thomas case kind of unfolds and what UGA does on the other side. I tend to believe he has played his last snap as a UGA Bulldog, but we'll see. We'll see what happens in that case and see how it's handled from the UGA side of things. But definitely a very, very big issue, and obviously we will unpack it as more of this information comes out. Ohio State made a lot of news this last week because it said that they spent $20 million on the roster for the football team this past year, and I know it's an insane amount of money, but it kind of makes sense. When you look back at what this last year was for Ohio State and you look back at all of the things that broke their way, that all of the things that went their direction, it makes sense that NIL was involved this way. And frankly, I don't know how it was split up. I don't know who got what, but you have to imagine that there was quite a bit of money pushed towards keeping the Denzel Burks, keeping the Jack Sawyers, keeping the JTTs in-house. If you can keep those guys, then you're likely in good shape going into 2024. I have to assume that's where a lot of the money went. And then you have Caleb Downs coming in, and then you have Will Howard coming in, and Quinshon Judkins. So there was plenty of money to go around. There's no two ways about that. I don't necessarily know how it was distributed, but overall, Ohio State's playing the game. This is the reality of the sport right now. If you can't play the NIL game, then you're going to have a really tough time competing in this sport. And it's going to be really interesting to watch all of this kind of unfold over the next couple of years as the revenue sharing comes into play. How much does the NIL go down? Does it go down at all? And which of these teams can kind of flex their muscles? Because Ohio State just proven a point that a lot of other schools can whenever they want, really, which is you can put a lot of money into these programs. The Texas of the world, Georgia, Alabama, they can do this pretty much at the drop of the hat. For the most part, they decide not to because it's a little bit of a slippery slope in some ways, but Ohio State decided that 2024 was the year, and they put about every resource they had into it. So it'll be interesting to watch if it was all in vain or if it all really, really meant something at the end of the day. So that'll be awesome to watch. But Billy Napier had a little bit of an update with his Jaden Rashada case. He and the others that are been mentioned in this case again, or have had a case filed against them, have all filed motions to dismiss it. I apologize. I'm getting lost in my words here. But Billy Napier filed motion to dismiss the $13.8 million case, name, image, and likeness case around Jaden Rashada. Obviously, this is something that is going to be really interesting to watch because it'll likely dictate a lot of what happens in the NIL world going forward and how teams go about business and how players go about business. And the big argument that Billy Napier is going after is what he said, whether he offered $13.8 million or not, he did not make him abandon that deal from Miami, which was hypothetically $9.5 million. So he's not necessarily culpable for Jaden Rashada making a not-so-great choice. And it's kind of an interesting thing. Definitely will be fascinating to watch. The two other people that were involved in this case, Marcus Castro Walker, a Florida staffer from back in the day, and Hugh Hathcock, a very powerful Florida Gators booster, have filed similar motions. So they're trying to get this thing dismissed, and frankly, I think it's going to be. I don't really know. I'm not necessarily a lawyer by any means, but I do think this is going to be one that it probably doesn't really amount to much. I think there is a reality where unless you can really prove that they lied and try to coerce you into not taking the Miami deal, there's not really an argument to be had here. So overall, it's going to be really important to how NIL is dealt with in the future and how, players approach it, teams approach it, how the NCAA approaches it. But overall, I tend to believe they might succeed here, and we'll see what happens, and we'll definitely update you as it kind of comes out. The Rose Bowl made some noise this past week because they want to stay at their same date and time. They want to stay on January 1st at 5 p.m., which would mean they would only be a quarterfinal game for the college football playoff. They would not be semifinal games. And frankly, I'm all in favor of this. They want to stay in line with that Rose Bowl parade on the 1st, and I think that's totally fine. With so many different things changing in the sport and a million different traditions going all over the place, I'm fine with this one staying the same. And I understand people's reaction to this where they saw the Rose Bowl and demanding something and they immediately went into defense mode because the Rose Bowl has been a little bit hoity-toity in the past, has been a little bit full of themselves. Let's just call it that. But I think it's definitely one of those things that overall it's probably a win for the sport, just keeping something intact when so many different things are changing. I'm going to take that as a win. And frankly, I could care less if any bowl games are in the playoff, if I'm being totally honest. I would have that totally separate and just have the college football playoff, and you play in the first round, the quarterfinals, and the semifinals. But at the end of the day, if you want to add, the Rose Bowl into it, or the Orange Bowl, or the Cotton Bowl, that's more than fine with me. But it sounds like the Rose Bowl might just be staying as a quarterfinal game going forward, and frankly, I think that's totally fine. I'm very much in favor of that. But the last thing I want to talk about is Mack Brown got a little bit salty in one of his press conferences recently. He was talking about some of the coaches around the sport and some of them saying, when is he going to retire? And pretty much every recruit walking into his office asking the exact same question because everyone else is saying that to him. This is the big time recruiting chip they have over North Carolina is saying, you're committing to a head coach. He's not going to be there next year, or he's not going to be there in 2 years. So it's definitely something that people are using against North Carolina, and Mack Brown was having absolutely none of it. And he said basically they need to worry about themselves because a lot of those guys that have said that have been fired by now. And I absolutely love this energy from Mack Brown. He is someone that deserves more respect than he gets, frankly, in the sport. He is one of the 3 active head coaches that have won a national title, and he should act that way. There's no two ways about that. So I understand this energy from Mack Brown. I understand how frustrating it might be for all of the big-time recruits that he wants on his team to walk into his office and immediately ask when he's leaving. That has to be incredibly frustrating, and frankly, I kind of like that he's fighting back just a little bit. So I would love to see a little bit more of this energy from Mack Brown. I don't know when he's going to wrap it up. Frankly, I've been pretty clear in saying I tend to think it's around that time, but at the end of the day, if he feels like he's coaching good football and UNC not necessarily reaching the heights that they want to reach, but always play really good football every single year. So I think he's still a really good head coach, and I do like a little bit of sass from Mack Brown from time to time. So obviously a very interesting headline there, one that is a little bit more fun than the rest of them, frankly, but it definitely is one that I absolutely laughed at and really enjoyed. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Thank you so much for listening. It means the world to us here. Also, remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. We have really incredible people doing great work across every single sport you could want. So come on over to GSMC and we have you totally covered here. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.